Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience, and welcome to today's webinar, Simplify Governance of Your IT Processes. My name is Cecile Hurley, and I will be one of the co-hosts on today's webinar. And joining me is my colleague and today's presenter, David Mainville. Before we get started, I'd like to run through some housekeeping. We do want to make sure that we have an interactive session today and that you have the ability to ask questions and make comments. On your screen, you should see a GoToWebinar control panel. If you don't see that right now, on your toolbar, look for an orange and white flower, and when you open that, you will see the GoToWebinar control panel. There is a place in there for questions, and so throughout today's presentation, if you do have something that you'd like to ask, please feel free to enter it here. We will also be doing some polling on today's webinar, so you will find a poll question come up in that GoToWebinar control panel, and you'll be able to provide some input. And lastly, we've also put some handouts in the handout section. You'll find, among other things, the slides from today's presentation and David's speaker notes, so you're welcome to access them there. What I'd like to do right now very quickly is ask you just to confirm that you're able to see us and hear us okay by entering your name and where you're joining us from in that GoToWebinar control panel, just in the question section. Just pop your name in there and the city that you're joining us from, and just to confirm that all the technology is working properly, and that would be much appreciated. Okay, great. I see that we have Lauren joining us from Minneapolis, Marie from Los Angeles, Bob joining us from New Jersey, Chuck from Madison, Costa from Montreal. Oh, lots. Matt from New Jersey, Gladys, Oklahoma. That's super. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate you doing that for me. Before I hand things off to my colleague David, I just want to tell you a little bit about Navvia, and then we'll be ready to get started with today's presentation. Navvia's been in business since 1999. And throughout that time, we've been an IT service management consulting firm helping organizations, helping organizations like the New York Stock Exchange, the Bank of New York Mellon, AIG, and others design robust business processes. In 2009, we took that experience and launched a software product, the Navvia Process Designer. And today, Navvia is one of the most cost-effective and innovative ways to design, document, and publish IT or business processes. Navvia has been specifically designed to help organizations save time and money when it comes to designing and documenting their processes. We've been recognized by Gartner in 2014 as a cool vendor, and then most recently, we've been published in the Market Guide for Enterprise Business Process Analysis, which just came out at the beginning of June. As you can see on the screen, we have some great clients, and this is just a small sampling. Companies like the Bank of New York, Bank of America, Deloitte, Symantec, amongst others. So what I'd like to do right now is to launch a quick poll just to get a sense from the folks on the screen, on the call today, who's making up our audience. We'd like to get to know a little bit about you, so if you could let us know what your role is within your organization. I'm going to just launch this poll. And if you could just do that for us, I would really appreciate it. Give us a sense of what your role is in your organization so that we can have an understanding of who our audience is. So while you're doing that, I will just mention for the folks who may have just joined us in progress that you do have the ability to ask questions throughout today's session. So we do encourage you to make sure that we keep this interactive. Okay, I see that we have about 6% of our audience are executive sponsors, 22% process owners, over 50% process managers, and a group of GRC professionals with us as well today. That's super. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate that insight. David, I'm ready to hand things over to you. So I'd like to introduce you to everyone. I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, David Mainville. David will be the presenter for today. David?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Cecile. Can you hear me okay?
I can. That's great. Thank you.
All right. So my name is David, and I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders here at Navvia. And my career in IT spans 37 years, where I've held many different roles. I've been an ITSM practitioner, a consultant, an architect, manager, and most recently, the executive responsible and accountable for our company's own internal IT compliance. So as a practitioner, I captured metrics that supported IT process governance, and I participated in many different process governance meetings. As a consultant and architect, I helped implement ITSM governance solutions. We have a product, as we mentioned earlier in this call, a SaaS application, and that SaaS application needs to conform to various standards, including SSA 16, COBIT, et cetera. And in that same light, many of our clients, a significant number of our clients, require us to provide evidence that our processes are compliant to their needs and standards. And that's not just IT processes like incident, problem, and change, but also things like our HR processes, how we do background checks on people. So I have a lot of experience in terms of responding to client demands and needs when it comes to process and internal compliance and governance. So I believe that this combined experience has really given me some insight into the importance of IT process governance, as well as some techniques they've implemented that can help you embed governance into your processes. So let's start with a question, and feel free just to provide some thoughts of your own in the chat panel if you wish, and we'll be able to discuss those. But let's start with a question. Do IT processes matter? In my position, I've met many people, and I've been fortunate to have worked as a consultant with many different organizations. And what constantly amazes me is IT's backlash against process. There are complaints and comments that process is bureaucratic or ITIL is dead. We don't have time to implement processes, say some folks, and we definitely don't measure them. I've seen new management come in and cancel ITSM programs just to see those same programs reinstated when management changes. And we're constantly confusing ITSM tools with processes. Just because you have a service desk tool doesn't mean you have a good incident management process. Some days I have to ask myself, do processes really matter? Well, the answer is yes. And I believe they matter more so now than they ever have before. IT is far more complex today. There are regulatory and compliance issues that people have to deal with, ensuring that you're compliant with various industry regulations. There's outsourcing. You have to ensure, because outsourcers are part of your supply chain, that they aren't basically putting you at risk because of their lack of controls or lack of process. And of course, there's cloud computing. Cloud computing is ever more prevalent, but do you really know how secure your cloud computer providers' systems are? You're not hosting them, you're not controlling them, you're just subscribing to them as a service. Can you be assured that your data is actually safe, secure, and there's no risks associated to your enterprise by hosting in the cloud? And then there's the security threats. Whether it's ensuring background checks of your staff occur, if people are properly onboarded or offboarded, if access rights are controlled. Each process that you have has numerous points that can actually put you at rest, put your security posture at risk, I should say. And then there's the influx of mobile devices. Not only managing these different devices, but more importantly, managing the data that's on these devices. The other thing I've seen more and more so is development pressures. Organizations are under increasing pressure to get things out the door quicker. And quite often, that means that certain shortcuts are taken. System monitoring isn't put in place. Security isn't put in place or embedded into the development process. So applications go out without the proper monitoring or security in place. And we're always being asked to do more with less. What are your thoughts on this? Are you seeing any of these issues in your organizations? Cecile, any comments from the audience?
Not at the moment, folks. You can put any comments that you'd like to make. Put them in the questions panel. That's great, and then we can discuss those. At the moment, just a couple of comments that yes, processes really do matter, of course. Time pressures, perhaps causing it to be less of a focus sometimes than other times. So that's pretty much about it right now, David. There are a couple of comments that yes, of course, processes do matter, and sometimes time gets in the way. One of the folks on the call, governance of development process is also a focus as well. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, well, all right. Well, I think, well, obviously process does matter, and there's many, many examples of why process does contribute to the proper running of an organization. But I think it's important that we actually get back to some basics here. So process 101. A process is a set of actions that transform inputs into value-added outputs. But the big elephant in the room here is, do we really understand what the value-added outputs are? Sometimes as IT folks, we make an assumption we know what the process is supposed to deliver. But really, a process is designed to meet business outcomes. And if we don't understand what the business is looking for out of a process, we run the risk of not being able to provide what the business needs to basically meet their objectives. Process success is basically success in process is the delivery of business value. And to understand that, you have to meet with the business and find out what is and what isn't working. You have to understand what inputs are needed to kick off the process. You have to understand the set of activities and tasks that are optimized for the business. And you have to really understand what the desired outputs are before you can construct a process that's actually going to be governed properly. But the piece that so many people leave out when it comes to process are the controls that oversee the process and the measurements that allow process to be governed. So the controls are those policies and guiding principles that define how the process will operate. A simple example might be, if an incident goes too long, it needs to be escalated. Well, what are the policies and guiding principles around that escalation? These controls can also be more aligned to regulatory controls, for example, like a COVID control, or following the principles of an SSA 16 audit or something of that like. And the metrics are very important, because without good metrics, you can't go back and make sure that the process is meeting the needs of the business. There are two really distinct aspects when it comes to process governance. So I think most of us understand that each individual IT process requires governance. Are the number of unresolved incidents or problems increasing? And what are we going to do about that? Are there more changes failing? What are we going to do about that? So each process into itself needs to be measured and managed to ensure that it's delivering value. And this layer of governance is really the responsibility of those who own and manage the individual processes. We also have to remember that processes are interconnected. So for example, the successful outcome of the service request process can be highly dependent upon the change management process. So if the service request requires a change be made to the infrastructure, but we have a weak change management process, that's going to make the service request process look bad because of those interconnections. So the processes need to work together. The process owners need to work together, perhaps through something like the Service Management Office, to make sure that these processes do in fact play well together. So how do we make sure the processes play well together to deliver the services? Well, you need to formalize process governance. You need to establish a governance approach that not only ensures individual processes are delivering business value, but that the entire system of processes are delivering value as a whole. Let's look at this from the perspective of a formal definition of IT governance. So looking at Gartner's definition, IT governance is defined as the processes that ensure the effective and efficient use of IT in enabling an organization to achieve its goals. Gartner further subdivides this into two pieces. There's basically IT demand governance, which is really under the responsibility of the business and defines what IT should be working on. So IT demand governance is what projects we're going to work on, it's portfolio management. It's really understanding where IT needs to place its focus. And that's really something that the business leads. But there's also IT supply side governance. And that's really the focus of today's conversation. Those are the processes that are in place to ensure that IT is delivering value, that the operation is working successfully, that all the processes are delivering what are expected of them. So we're going to be talking more on the whole supply side of the IT governance aspect. When it comes to this supply side governance, I think you could really look at it much more succinctly. I think there's a much simpler way of stating what governance is all about. And to me, it's not taking your eye off the ball. If you take your eye off the ball, processes will degrade over time. And that's a fact of life. You see it all the time. If you don't require or enforce somebody to implement a change or to document a change, they're probably not going to do it. If you're not going to require and govern the fact that someone has to have a well-documented backup plan, chances are they're not going to do it because time pressure takes hold and other things take hold and people will take shortcuts in the process. So without process governance, the capability will degrade over time. The problem is you're going to get to a point where a major issue occurs and one that can have a devastating impact to the organization. So I asked this question earlier, do IT processes matter? Well, you know, I had the opportunity a few years ago to do an exercise at a major financial institution in New York. And I was in there on a consulting engagement. And one of the things we were trying to do was to demonstrate the importance of process and process governance. So in this exercise, what I did is I got to sit down individually with the IT leadership team. So I sat down individually with different leaders in IT, the head of development, the head of operations, et cetera, and sat down and asked them some pretty simple questions. Over the last 6 months, can you recall a number of incidents that caused extreme disruption to the organization? Incidents that were very serious, had a high level of impact. So I went around and asked each of these people that same question and then pulled all the results together. And what ended up happening is there was approximately 4 to 5 common incidents that everyone agreed was of high impact to the organization. So I did some analysis of those incidents, went back and looked at each of those 4 to 5 incidents that bubbled to the top. And in every case, the incident was a direct result of not following prescribed process. In every case. I also met with the folks from the disaster recovery team because they've done a lot of work. They had done a lot of work in business impact analysis, putting a price tag on the cost of an incident. And I wasn't surprised to find out that when you looked at those incidents that had bubbled to the top, that everyone agreed was very disruptive to the organization, and that were the direct result of processes not being followed. It turned out they had an impact in the millions of dollars, not including the reputation to the organization, to their stakeholders in terms of quality of service being delivered. So those incidents had a direct monetary impact, but they also had an impact to the reputation of the organization because of impacts to delivery. When all is said and done, it comes down to accountability. Because if you took a look at that little example I gave, it was in every case an example of someone not following a process that was prescribed. And the implication was very, very serious of not following the process. Individuals are responsible for following process. That's why governance to me is all about accountability. More importantly, there needs to be a governance structure that ensures that people understand the importance of process because without understanding what the importance of process are, why would I want to follow it? If I don't understand why something's important, why would I want to do it? So it's important to understand, why the process is important, but it's also equally important that I understand what the process is that I have to perform. In many organizations, folks can't even find where the processes are documented. There's an assumption out there that there's a consistent process being applied to, whether it's incident, problem, change, or any of the process areas. But the reality is people are doing it their own way. And there also has to be accountability when it comes to monitoring that the processes are being performed properly. And for that, I think some very key roles need to be defined. For every process, there has to be an owner, and not only a name, but someone with the ability and authority to ensure the process is rolled out and used by all departments within the IT organization. This person has to be responsible for defining the overall mission of the process, establishing and communicating that mission and goals to others, resolving any cross-functional or departmental issues. Why is this group using the process and that group not using the process? So a process owner has to be at a level in the organization where they have that authority to be able to go out and address those changes. And I said earlier, it has to be more than in name only, because in many organizations, unfortunately, I've seen people be named process owners because they have a certain rank in the organization, as opposed to a desire to actually own, manage, and ensure that the process is being implemented properly. So they need to ensure the consistent execution of the process. They need to make sure that the reporting of the process is done and that all continual improvement activities happen. And supporting the process owner in this is the process manager. The process manager needs to be in place because they are responsible for the day-to-day execution of the process. So if they're a change manager, they're holding the change meetings, they're running the cab. If they're an incident manager or an incident coordinator, they're making sure the incidents are coming in, they're being prioritized, they're being allocated to the right groups, and that they're being followed up on. So the process manager is really key because they're really doing the day-to-day work to make sure the process is being performed. Whereas the process owner is making sure that everyone is following that everyone understands what the process is and is following it. The process manager makes sure it's executed on a daily basis. But I think there needs to be something even bigger than that, because I mentioned before, these processes work together in a system. So, if you have an organization where you have a very effective process owner and process manager in incident management, but nobody handling problem management, well, that's fine to a point. You might be getting incidents resolved quickly, but incidents that you can't resolve that are handed off to problem management may never get resolved. So it's important that there needs to be something that looks at all of the processes together as a holistic system and ensures that governance is applied across that. Some call it a governance team, others may call it a service management office, but it's really a group of people who are responsible for the process design standards, tool implementation standards, metrics and reporting, communications, and continual process improvement. It's really important that these people be in place because it provides structure over your whole ITSM process initiative. Without this structure, things are going to start falling through the crack. Things will start operating in silos. You'll have areas of excellence where, for example, incident management is going really well, but you'll have other areas where you don't have things going as well. Change management, because you're not providing a consistent layer of governance across all the processes. And what's important is these processes, as I said before, are interconnected. They work together to deliver the services that you provide. So without an overarching body, an overarching process, it's very difficult to provide the governance that you need. So some of the things that are really important as part of a governance team, you have to be able to set these standards for tools, for processes, for reporting, for continual service improvement. But you also have to make sure that there's some authority and accountability within this team to ensure that that governance actually gets performed, so that there's some authority that says you will be doing this process, you will be doing it this way, and some rules within this team that ensure that those controls against the process are actually being measured to ensure that the process is in fact being followed. So these individuals must work together to really build an IT governance approach. And the approach that I think really works well based on my experience working, in both as a consultant and as someone who's implementing processes in our own organization, is one of assess, design, and verify. It's important to assess your processes to make sure there are no gaps. There's no issues with the capability of those processes. And more importantly, not only to identify whether there are or are not gaps, but to look at what you need to improve in the process. It's also very important that you have standards around the design, implementation, and execution of the process. So when I talk about design here, it actually extends into the implementation and execution, because that's all relevant to the design of the process. And lastly, it's important to make sure that the processes are verified against their established controls. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about the assessment side of things. So why is process assessment important? Well, I think it's important from a number of reasons. First of all, it opens a dialogue with your stakeholders. You really can't have effective process governance without the support of your stakeholders. If people aren't following the process, they don't believe in the process, you're already placed at a major disadvantage. Governance can be, you can basically dictate that the processes are going to be governed, but it's a lot better to make sure that people are supporting you in your processes. And the beauty of an assessment is it gives you the opportunity to sit down and meet with people face to face to ensure you understand what is and what's not working with the processes. It's a great way of building support and getting people on board with process. It's also a catalyst for change. If your processes are not delivering the desired outcomes, an assessment allows you to learn why by talking to people and then getting their support to improve things for the better. An assessment provides you with a baseline from which ROI can be measured. I said earlier in my presentation that the numerous times I've seen ITSM programs canceled and then reinstated. Well, in many cases, those programs are canceled because there's no evidence that the ITSM work is actually delivering any value. And how do you show, or how do you prove that value is being delivered without metrics and measurements? So an assessment is a great way of providing a baseline from which the ROI can be measured. And it has direct implications to governance. If you can, the assessment, if you can get people on board and supportive of the governance initiative, if you can have that dialogue with your stakeholders, if you can demonstrate that there's an ROI, there's a much better sense, or a much better chance, I should say, that your governance program will be accepted and embedded and adopted in your organization, and that the processes will run better. And then, of course, there's identifying the gaps that lead to improvements. If you sit down and you talk to your various business stakeholders and find out what's bothering them about a current implementation of a process, why changes are too difficult to implement or too difficult to document, or perhaps why service requests take too long, these things can actually lead to an improvement in the process. And when processes are running smoothly, there's less chance people are going to deviate from the process. So that's why it actually ties into governance. I mean, governance is all about ensuring you're meeting the appropriate business outcomes. So there's a side of governance which is measuring and controlling, but there's a side of governance that says you have to have the structure put in place in a way that people want to follow and want to adopt, or else you're going to be fighting a battle with people. So it's easier to get people working with something that they like and they support than with something they don't. And an assessment is an awesome way to get that engagement started, to learn what people want, and to start heading down the path towards improvement. So what are some techniques for conducting this assessment? One of the things that's really important is to sit down and talk to people. So I've always recommended you sit down and have interviews with key stakeholders. There's nothing better than looking, eye to eye across the table from somebody and asking them, what's working with this process? What's not working with this process? What frustrates you? If you had one wish, what would make this process better? So these interviews with the key stakeholders are critical because it gives you a really good in-depth sense of what these key stakeholders think about the process, and some of the things that you might be able to do to resolve it. And again, it's important to do that face to face. I know it's sometimes hard to get critical feedback from folks, but you can't improve something without getting that feedback. And of course, that's opening up that dialogue, which is going to, again, help you get support for the processes. So it's one thing then to get the interviews with the key stakeholders. The next thing is you have to bring together some of the subject matter experts so you can go deep into the process. And one of the interesting things I've learned from having these subject matter experts come together is how much they sometimes differ on their opinions of what the processes do. And that's in itself, it's some great insight. You know, I've brought people into the room and asked a question. It could have been something as simple as, are your processes documented? And one person says, yep, these processes are documented. And someone across the other side of the room says, what are you talking about? I don't know what these processes are. And these are the subject matter experts. So workshops with subject matter experts are very important because not only do they allow you to go deep, but they allow you to identify any conflicting views or perspectives on the process. The third way, and the third piece of conducting an assessment, is you've got to get the input from a wider group of people. And you can't spend the time or energy meeting with every single person in an organization. So a structured questionnaire is often a very good way to go wide, to allow you to but allow you to solicit the input from a large number of people and bring that input into the organization, and then use that in combination with the workshops, what you learned from the workshops and what you learned from the interviews, to come up with a set of findings as to what is and what's not working in the processes. So questionnaires are great, and they allow you to go wide. One thing that's very important in the interviews, workshops, and questionnaires is that they be consistent, that there was some thought as to what goes into an interview. So the questions you ask one stakeholder are the same questions you ask another stakeholder. When you run the workshops, you're going through the same list of subject matter questions, because you don't want to just do this in an ad hoc fashion. So it's very important that you sit down and organize and plan what it is you're going to do, and then bring all this information together and go back to your constituents through validation sessions to confirm the findings, to make sure that you've heard things correctly, and that gives you an opportunity not only to validate what you've heard, but to get any additional dialogue going, and really be assured that the information that you got is actually accurate. Also, by doing the validation, it's harder for people to come back after the fact and disagree with your findings because you've taken the time to validate them with the individuals. And lastly, to develop a roadmap that can help you implement these improvements. So when you take a look at assessment as a whole, it's really about talking to people. It's really about finding out what is and what isn't working. And you can argue with me that it has nothing to do with governance or compliance. I would argue it has everything to do with governance and compliance, because if you don't make the effort to understand what is and isn't working, if you don't take the effort to talk to people and find out what needs to be improved, if you don't make the effort and actually engage folks, you're going to have a much harder time getting people to adopt or adhere to the processes that you put in place. This is all about organizational change and communications, and it's a critical component of. I'm sorry, I think I'm having a seal. Can you hear me? I think we just had a drop off.
No, I can hear you okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. So this is a really critical component of understanding what is and isn't working. And I think it's because of that, it's so much tightly aligned to governance. It's really an important aspect of it, even though some people might not see assessment on its surface as being an important part of a compliance or governance program. I just wanted to take just a minute to show you one of the ways that I've done assessments in my, as a consultant, back when we were doing that. One of the things we often did is create standardized assessment questionnaires. So I'm just popping into the Navvia to conduct process maturity and capability assessments in an organization. So you can see here, I've taken a look at something called an annual ITSM assessment. I was able to build a structure questionnaires for
David,
problem
David,
changes,
David,
bringing in these assessment questionnaires from one of 200 different templates that we have set up in the background. But the next thing is that you can send them out to different groups of people.
David.
Hello.
Hi, David. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but your audio is breaking up. Some of the folks on the call are having some difficulty hearing with you, so you might be having a slight problem with the internet. I just wanted to mention that.
Am I clear now, or?
Yeah, you're okay now. It was when you switched over to start.
You're breaking up for this, folks. This is always a challenge when it comes to these types of things. I'm gonna fall back to a backup internet.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, David. Thanks for your patience, everyone. David will be right back with us. He's just going to switch over to a backup connection. We do appreciate your patience for that, and he will be back online again in just a short second. Hi.
Yeah, I just switched over to another connection. Is that any better?
You sound better now. Just start using Navvia again, and I'll confirm it for you.
Okay. So what I was getting at is, the importance of having a very structured way of performing these assessments. And one of the things I was mentioning is the ability to go wide to a large number of people. So by using structured question sets, for example, structured questionnaires around problem, change, configuration management, is a great way to start. But the next important piece is to identify the groups of people who you want to send these questionnaires to. So if you're able to say, look, I want to send some of these questionnaires to management because I want to understand what they think, or executives, I want to understand what they think, or I want to send some to the service desk. It's great to be able to get your results coming in and say, well, here's what people think as a whole, but it's also nice to be able to segment those results into various groups. So that's something I highly recommend, is whenever you do a type of questionnaire, you basically want to not only send the questionnaires to an audience, but you want to identify who that audience belongs to and make sure that you select people from different groups so you can do these comparisons. What does management think? What does executives think? What are what do different areas think? And then be able to send out those questionnaires to the particular participants. Not everyone understands incident management, so don't send them an incident management questionnaire. So having the flexibility to be able to allocate the questionnaires to the right groups and the right people is very, very important. What's also very important too is to be able to track these assessments as they're coming in. So in our Navvia tool, one of the things we do is we make sure that every time an assessment questionnaire goes out, we basically track whether someone has started, someone has completed, and provide the ability to go in and notify folks if we need to prompt people to. And it's also transparency. You can go back to management and say, look, we're spending this time and energy going out assessing the processes, but we haven't received all of the feedback. So you can use this as a really transparent way of indicating who has not completed an assessment. And one of the things we've structured here in Navvia is the ability to do assessments on a variety of frameworks. So whether it's ITEL or COBIT 4 or COBIT 5 or ISO 20000 or ISO 15504, there's over 200 pre-built questionnaires that can really help. But the real important thing is, when it comes down to the results. And with a tool like this, you're able to basically easily bring these results back, calculate scores, see how well the project is progressing, and even drill into a lot of detailed reports that allow you to show things like the overall maturity of your processes and how they compare with each other.
David?
Yes, Cecile?
I'm so sorry. I hate to say this, but I think your screen is frozen. So if you're on the reports tab, that's not what we're seeing.
I really don't know what this, I'm sorry.
I know, I apologize. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. It just switched now. We're looking at the radar chart. Thank you.
Am I going to have to go to my third backup internet? Because I do have
I don't know.
Believe it or not, I was a Boy Scout and I do have a third backup on my internet.
You do have a third backup.
I do have I can't believe this. Oh my.
I know.
Sorry,
as you're switching, when you switch off the screen, just mention it and I'll let you know if we're in sync, okay?
Okay, that would be helpful.
Thanks.
So this is a great way of seeing how the processes look overall. allows you to drill into a particular process against a particular domain, or drill in and see how each individual question in a survey has been responded to. So this is, a really powerful way of seeing, for example, in this case, different responses from a subject matter expert. So it gives you an indication that, wow, maybe not everybody understands how this process works. Two people said this, one person said that. Why is that the case? So having a good structure, and I guess that's the emphasis I'm trying to make here. Whether you use a tool like Navvia or whether you do this manually, it really doesn't matter. But what's important, it's a consistent, structured way. It's important that you go out and you solicit information from a wide variety of groups. It's important that you understand what each group says so you can contrast it to each other, because that's going to give you insight into where some of these gaps might be. So for example, you might, if one group really thinks the process is rock, like here's a good example of that. If I ran a report called the comparative project scores and asked to see the comparison between everybody and management, if I saw results that looked something like this, and Cecile, I just changed screens.
Yep, it worked.
Well, if I saw a result that looked something like this, I'd be surprised, right? Because why did one group of people think the process is rock and another group and everyone else in the organization think there was a real issue? This shows a disconnect. And without standardized questionnaires and without a methodology to do it, you're not going to uncover these. You might be inclined just to ask management what they think and get an impression that's very different than the reality that's out there. And that's not going to help you improve the governance of your processes.
And David, as you're switching back to the presentation, we did have a question from Diane with regards to assessments. And she was asking for your thoughts on what to do when people are more focused on the tool configuration and not wanting to consider the process. What do you do about, trying to do an assessment in that kind of an environment?
That's a great question. And, more often than not these days, people think of process design as opening up a tool and configuring screens. And that's a real problem. And that's why, and I think you almost answered your own question. That's why the assessment is important. Because if you can sit down and talk to somebody and say, what's not working in this process for you? Well, what's not working is, it's way too cumbersome to enter a change request. So you then have a follow-up question. So if that's the case, what is the information that you're looking for? Because going in and just customizing the screens isn't going to solve that problem. Or if a service request is taking too long, if the fundamental business problem is it's taking 6 weeks to provision or onboard a new employee with all of the IT facilities that they need, if that's the underlying business problem, it's very easy to say, how will configuring a screen change that? So you almost have to use it. I'm almost, turn this on its head. You use the assessment to convey those things. The assessment is the way you go out and actually initiate and sit down and talk to folks to ask the questions that are going to, they're going to have people pondering, saying, yeah, there's more here than a tool. A tool doesn't tell me who's responsible. A tool doesn't tell me what I have to do. So I'm not sure if I answered this correctly, and I apologize if I'm rambling a little bit on this, but the assessment itself is a way that's going to help you open up the discussion so you can begin to broach those conversations with people. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next part, which is design. And again, people might say to me, David, governance, isn't that about auditors coming in and checking whether or not we're doing the process, or, counting how many, having somebody come in and do a spot check of how many incidents were closed? Sure, that's a part of governance, but design, I think, is just as important part of governance, because a good process design engages stakeholders, and by engaging your stakeholders, you can drive commitment. So if you sit down and talk to the people who are going to be, involved day to day with these processes, and ask them what it is they're trying to accomplish, what problems they're trying to solve, and get their input into the design of process, it's more likely they're going to follow the process. And that's, again, I believe it was Diane's comment, that's a lot more about fields on a screen. That's about, the requirements to open an incident, to verify the this is about the flow. So the good design actually engages people to drive commitment. It helps you align the process to the outcomes by asking people what it is you're trying to achieve from the process. The other thing is process is about people more than anything else. People perform process, unless you're a machine and it's a machine process, but it identifies what needs to be done and who's responsible for doing it. So you can have all the tools in the world, but if I don't know, I have to log in here and approve that, or I don't know, I have to go in there and invalidate, do an evaluation or a review that this, list of this bill of materials for a service request are in fact accurate and conform to our company's internal policies and standards. If I don't know I'm supposed to do that, no amount of tools is going to solve that problem for me. Yeah, you can say I get an email notification to do something, but without understanding that flow and who's responsible, you can't even configure the tool to do it properly. So a good process design identifies what needs to be done and who's responsible. It allows you to establish the controls for process governance. And I think that's important too, because when these processes are being audited, they're being audited against controls. Whether those controls are things like, is there a separation of responsibilities between development and operation, or if the control says that there has to be an emergency change procedure in place for a change process, that's a typical SOX control. By building those, by speaking to the business, by speaking to the audit side of the house and understanding what controls need to be in place for these processes, you can build them into your process. And as you're building them to the process, you're also driving the requirements for process automation. The number of times I've seen people try to, have all of these controls and metrics for a process, but the tool doesn't generate the metrics because no one accounted for capturing the data from which those metrics are built. You can't calculate mean time between failure if you don't capture when it failed and when it last failed. You just can't do that. So metrics require that you capture a certain amount of data, and not every metric you're looking to measure or every control you want in place comes out of the box in a tool. So without sitting down and establishing your controls and using that to drive your process automation, you're going to be in a deficit. So some of the best practices for process design include making sure you have those process owners and managers in place, and not in name only. I mean, don't name a process owner just because they're an executive. A process owner has to be able to sit down and make sure that process is followed by everybody. And if they don't do that, they're not performing the role of the process owner. Make sure the managers understand what their roles and responsibilities are. I think it's just as important to adopt a standard for process design, because having a standard way all processes are designed and documented is good for your users, because when they pick up a process document, they're going to understand this is where I find my roles. This is where I find, what I'm responsible for in the processes. This is where I understand what the metrics or the controls are. In many organizations, they just let everyone design a process their own way. Some people do it in Visio, one or two pages. Some people do a very comprehensive Word document. Well, if they're in a haphazard format, it's going to be hard to get people to adopt them because they're going to be hard to understand. I think it's also really important that when you design your processes, there's facilitated workshops to identify these business requirements. By getting the people who are going to be, key involved in the process, having their input so that it's brought into the design so that you meet those outcomes. Remember, IT governance is about ensuring that IT processes are in place to ensure business outcomes. Well, you can't do that if the process isn't delivering business outcomes. So why is design key to governance? Because you can't govern something that's poorly designed. So having these standards, doing the facilitated workshops, drilling down into those detailed tool and data requirements that support the process are all a critical part. You also have to ensure, as part of design, that you have an organizational change program, because people need to know why a process is important, and they have to know what the process is. So organizational change gets people on board, it trains them, it gives them the underlying reasons why a process needs to be followed, and it also gives them the training they need so they can perform it. It's crazy if someone says, I don't need to train someone on pick whatever tool it might be. I don't really want to name one right now, but all the great ITSM tools. Oh, you don't need to train anyone on that tool. It's a cloud application. It's like using Amazon.com. That is not true. Processes, you need to provide training on processes. People come and go, new employees come in. So there needs to be not only an organizational change program to get people to adopt, but a training program to keep people current. And then you also have to centralize your process documentation. So without centralizing the process documentation, if you don't know where the process is, there really isn't a process. It's as simple as that. And don't assume everyone knows what the process is. And if they're not centralized, you could have people working on old versions of the process, or what they have on their desktop versus something that's coming from a central repository of truth. So one of the ways that we tried to solve that issue with Navvia is by providing a central repository of processes where you can have things like a development workspace where you're building new processes, or an approval workspace, or the company's process library where you publish processes to an entire organization. And then to use some technology to make people who probably don't design processes every day, some folks who you really don't understand, what should be in a process, what the various elements of the process are, and give them a structured way of pulling them together, and a way that they can do it in a collaborative, facilitated way. So you can basically, in a design workshop, bring up a change management process, look at the first activity of change management, and Cecile, I'm on the change process now.
Yep, it's working.
Good thing I had a backup internet. So look at the first, activity of change management, and start, drilling in and looking at the details and making changes on the fly, and allowing you to build this process out, and then immediately from a structure which everyone is familiar with, here's a flow diagram of the process, immediately produce standardized documentation. So whether you're building an incident management process or a change management process, it comes out looking the same way. It comes out with the same level of detail that's required to fully document a process, and done in a structured way, so you don't have to be a process guru to be able to do this. You can start with one of our many, many templates. We have templates for a variety of process areas, ITEL, COBIT, ServiceNow, and then be able to do from that, just build the process documentation. And I think I'm having some internet issues again, Cecile. I apologize.
You sound okay. No, it's coming.
So from that diagram, automatically create a document. So you don't have to be a process guru to come in here and do this. Let someone else who understands process better develop that structure and those standards, but easily be able to maintain and produce documentation. So, and have it in a centralized place against the standard, and be able to drill all the way down into the details you need to really demonstrate what the process is all about, all the way down to those technical data levels. So design is a very, very important aspect of governance, because it sets those standards. And when the auditors come in, they'll see you have all your processes in a central repository, designed and documented to a great level of depth in a standard format. And that's a really important part to an overall governance program. The last piece is verifying that your processes are being followed. That's really important. So verification is important because it confirms alignment to business outcomes. So again, if you look at the definition of IT governance, is making sure that the process is in place to ensure that business outcomes are met. Well, the verification is the way you go and check that. Be able to go and check to make sure that these service requests are happening quicker, or the number of incidents are going down, or at least they're being resolved quicker. So whatever those business outcomes you deem are important, verification, it gives you the ability to be able to demonstrate that they're being achieved. And if I go back to that whole issue I raised earlier, where I see a lot of backlash towards IT process or ITSM programs, don't shoot the messenger. I mean, the reason many of those programs fail is because of poor implementation, not because the concepts are bad. Having a good process that's repeatable is good for an organization. Where they tend to fall down is they were built without really understanding what the outcomes needed to be, and they're not being verified that they're being performed, and they're not being governed to make sure that they're being executed. So failure in ITSM programs is less about the fact that process is there, and more about the fact that the process isn't being followed or isn't well designed. So verification is, if you look at the cycle of assess, design, and verify, it's that last step that really says, okay, I've designed something, are people following it? It can also ensure that you're supporting the regulatory requirements. So I mentioned that we have a SaaS product, and when people ask me, show me that you have an incident management system, I can show them I have an incident management system. I have documented processes and procedures. I have a history. I can show we have an onboarding process and an offboarding process, and I can show evidence that that process is updated on a regular basis. And that allows me to support the needs of the people that I work with. And so having this verification in place, so I mean, there's internally, we verify that our processes are followed, and we use the verification program to set up continuous improvement and process updates. So, every 6 months, we review our security practices to make sure our security posture is, especially in this day and age where there's so many breaches, to make sure our security posture is good. But, we verify that we do that every 6 months and communicate to the staff, all the latest issues that they should be aware of, et cetera. And then even have some more reactive parts of the process that if there is a major thing that comes out, that we take immediate action. So I'm able to, with a good verification program, you can show that your processes meet requirements. And it immunizes you against process degradation, because it puts in this continual cycle of monitoring what you've done so that processes won't degrade over time. I'm telling you, you leave people to their own devices, you're going to end up with a catastrophe that's going to put you in a very bad light. And the verification, if it's built into the process program, is critical to ensure that your processes are continuing to meet the needs of the business. It also helps you identify opportunities for continual improvement. So some of the techniques that I think are very important is, first of all, you have to understand all of the different frameworks you're required to report against. I've worked with some organizations where they've showed me a spreadsheet that has something from the Cloud Security Alliance, something from Sarbanes-Oxley, something from COBIT, something from SSA 16, something from SOX. It has all of these different frameworks, and they're running around and every so often asking somebody a dozen questions about their process to support the needs of each of those frameworks. Well, the interesting thing is there's a lot more similarity between those frameworks there's more similarity than you might think. So it's important to map your controls to the processes, then to the roles. And when you have your controls mapped to the processes, you can also map them to the different frameworks and be able to see whether, if I have to show evidence that there's a separation of duties, that can actually be relevant to more than one framework. So identify all the frameworks you need to report against, map your controls to the processes and then to the people that need to perform them, and then create periodic tasks that go out and collect the evidence of compliance. So rather than having a fire drill when audit comes around, you basically are collecting on a periodic basis all the evidence of compliance that were mapped to the controls of the processes. And then you establish that governance body, which I talked about, who's responsible for overseeing that verification. The idea here also is to audit once and map controls to multiple frameworks so that you can, with one action, meet the needs of multiple frameworks. Nobody has time to be doing it responding to these questionnaires multiple times. If you can audit once and map to many, you're really going to save yourself a lot of time and energy when it comes to the audit piece. One of the ways we handle that with the Navvia tool, and we use this when we help clients set up governance, is to go ahead and do that in advance by mapping controls to frameworks through templates. So we have a wide variety of templates, COBIT 4, COBIT 5, ISO 20000, that basically allow you to create tasks where you basically have the name of a task, a description of the task, which control objective from the various frameworks that task maps to, what process it maps to, what role it maps to, and then allows you to set a schedule. And then Navvia will go out and tap people on the shoulder on a regular basis. Why is this good? Because it's not a fire drill. By doing this in a very periodic, controlled way, you're bringing the evidence of compliance back to a central repository so that you can basically track the execution of these process controls, perform remediation if you need, but more importantly, drill into the information so you can see that your processes are in fact compliant, and if they're not, where those gaps are. And do that in a very structured way as opposed to a fire drill a few days before an audit. And what that gives you is that it closes the loop of assess, design, and verify. It gives you, you've designed your controls as part of your process. Now you're actually tracking the controls, requesting evidence of compliance. Then you can go back into the cycle again and do another periodic assessment to make sure that everything you've done up to that point is still delivering value. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Assess, design, and verify. That's your path to IT process governance. Without governance, entropy is going to take hold and your processes are going to begin to fail. So governance is a process unto itself. That assess, design, verify is in fact a governance process. It's the way that you can build governance into your organization. You have to build governance into your process design. You can't ignore the people aspect of governance because engaging folks, getting their buy-in, getting their support, making sure they perform the processes because they've been trained and they understand why, all of that's really critical because that's going to simplify governance if people are actually performing the processes of their own free will. And the last thing you want to do is not wait until the next big disaster strikes. If you remember that little curve of process capability and time, you take your eye off the ball, you are going to have a disaster. And that might mean the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever the paper might be. You don't want to be there. You don't want to be the next major data breach or the next big, outage that's being reported. You want to make sure that you're controlling your processes so that you have consistent delivery and that you're meeting the needs and the outcomes of the business. So that brings us to the end of today's presentation. I gave you a little bit of demonstration throughout of the Navvia product. If you have some interest, we do have a weekly demo that goes into a full demonstration of the product. To sign up for the demo, you just go to navvia.com/demo and you can sign up for that. Otherwise, I'd be happy to stick around and answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, David. We did have a couple of questions, so thanks everyone for your attention today. There are a couple of questions, so David's going to stick around for a couple of minutes to make sure that we get those answered. So we do appreciate your time. We will be sending out this webinar in an email. You'll receive a follow-up with a link to the recording. And as David mentioned, you can always find out more about us up on our website. We did have a couple of people that did ask some information about Navvia. So folks, if you go up to our website, www.navvia.com, you will find information about the product, and David's just going to pop over there now. Thanks, David. You will find information about the Navvia product, what's included in the subscription, how the subscriptions are, the technology behind Navvia, and also information about the pricing. So you're more than welcome to pop up there to find out more information. And then if you do want to get in touch with us, you can register for a demo, you can request a free trial, or you can use our Contact Us page to get in touch. David, we had a couple of questions from Saroja, and the question was around governance and who should the governance team report to in the organization so that the process is followed for the best interest of the organization. And also, second part of that question is if you have any recommendation on tying the governance team to the board of directors.
Those are both very good questions. So when in the governance program that we were talking about today, so there's different levels of governance. As I mentioned in Gartner's description, there's supply side governance and there's demand side governance. I think as you move further up the chain, there needs to be a tie of governance to the board of directors. In the particular process governance, which I was talking about today, I think it's just sort of these are levels. So these actually would report up to a bigger governance body that would perhaps report to the board of directors. I mean, the board of directors is probably not as interested in understanding the specifics around incident, problem, or change as they are about bigger, more business-oriented issues. So when I talk about the governance program, I think it needs to report into the CIO of the organization because we're talking about the basically the supply side governance here. This is making sure that IT has the internal processes and procedures to deliver the service. And I think that's the responsibility of the CIO, and that team should report into the CIO. I've seen these governance teams alongside with architecture teams and the project portfolio office. So they're sort of in the same, the same level in the organization. So they don't report into operations or they don't report into development. They have to be an equal player to operations, development, and report into the CIO.
Great, thank you, David. Saroja was also asking if we had any additional information around surveys, around assessments, that whole concept of go deep and go wide, and any resources that we could point towards to provide some additional information on that.
Sure, there's a variety of places that you could find this information. I mean, in addition to what we have in Navvia, where we have the 200 different assessment questionnaires and all of the automatic and reporting, there is some information on assessments on the APMG website. So if you basically search for, if you go to APMG, there's a kind of an ITEL process assessment. It's not automated. It's more spreadsheet oriented, which means that there's going to be some manual effort, but that exists. I've seen assessment questionnaires on the ISACA website, so that's another good place that you might want to look. And again, the information is there, and you could utilize it. So there are a number of places. I mean, other vendors, obviously have different consultancies have their approaches to doing assessments. What we've done is we've actually built our 200 plus assessment questionnaires over our, well, we've been in business since 1999. So we used a combination of our own best practices along with aligning it to standards like COVID 4, COVID 5, ISO 20000. So there are a variety of resources, not only Navvia, ISACA is one, APMG is another.
Great, thank you. Also, Saroja, up on our website on navvia.com under our resources page, you will find information up there as well. There is an article that's actually posted up there from a former client of ours who has used, who has a lot of expertise in the assessment side of things, and there's a good article up there called Assess or Get Lost. That might be also something that's of interest. And of course, if you have any questions and you need some help or guidance, you can always get in touch with us via our website. And David is just showing that up there now. Thank you very much, David. Okay, I think that is it. We did have a request from Chuck, but I see that he actually had to leave us. If whether or not you would be having a governance, some additional follow-up discussions about the demand governance side of things, and whether we would be doing another governance webinar in the future. And folks,
That's a great.
Yeah,
that's a great idea, actually. Yeah.
So I told him that I would check on that and get back to him via email. I think that's it, everybody. Thanks so much for your time today and your patience. David, there doesn't seem to be any additional questions, so I believe we're ready to get things wrapped up.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. And sorry about those technical issues that we had. I'm glad they resolved themselves.
Good backup planning.
Yeah.
Thanks again, everybody.
That's the Boy Scout in me. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.